You can view the activity monitor by right-clicking the name of the server instance here at the top of Object Explorer. So I have an activity monitor item there, and that is the interface into the activity monitor. So as you can see, there's several grids up here that show real-time activity on the server. Now, this is a little bit of an artificial situation because this is a development machine. I'm the only one on it. There aren't other applications that are accessing the data and so forth. So there really have been no queries in the last little bit, and so nothing is showing that's going on. But so if there were activity, you would see some graphical information there. And then there's various other sections that you can expand in order to drill down into different parts of the activity that's currently going on with this server. So what I'm going to do is attempt to simulate a little bit of intense activity. So I'll go back over here to Object Explorer Details, select Tables, and for some of the larger tables, I'm going to right-click on the item, and I'm going to come up here and script the table as a select to a new query editor window. This is a really nice feature of Management Studio that essentially writes script for you. So I want to write a select statement for that particular table, and I want to open it up in a new query editor window. But I could also save it to a file, copy it to the clipboard, or create an agent job that will presumably run at some future date, maybe repeated like every day, every week, every month, or whatever. So I'll come over here into new query window. So this creates all of the fields that are within the table, and I'll go ahead and execute that. As you can see, it takes a few seconds to run, and it pulls back all 228,265 rows of data. So I'm going to do that for one more table. I think we have another big one down here. Yeah, stock item transactions. So I'll right-click on that and select to yet another new query editor window. And I'll go ahead and run that. So it takes a couple seconds. I'll execute it again. I'll execute it again. Execute it again. While that's going, I'll come back over here and execute that. Come back over here and execute that. Come back over here and execute that. So now I've simulated some activity against the server, and I can start to see that I've had a spike in processor time. It went up to a little over 40%. It's now gradually tailing off. There's no waiting tasks. I didn't have any contention for resources because I was just directly accessing each table's data. Database I/O in megabytes per second. See, there's a little bit of a spike there. Batch requests. I kept hitting the execute button, and so forth. So that shows you just a little kind of insight into what might be happening on a real server. Now, if I was connected to a real production server that has several web applications for some large enterprise, and there are thousands upon thousands of hits on the website, and therefore the database every second or every minute, then I'd be seeing a lot more activity go by on these monitors. Okay, but a real handy way of seeing what's going on. Now, besides the graphs there are these different sections. So you have the processes section. So you can see that, oh, I still have something running. Oh, that's against the temporary DB. So that's probably some sort of background kind of action going on. But what the Processes tab does is it displays information about database connections and the types of tasks that each is performing. So this data is listed by the server process ID. So if I come in here and expand these columns a little bit so you can actually see what they are, you can see that they're the full column names here. So if I continue expanding the columns, you can see that it has different kinds of information about the processes that the server is currently executing. Okay, there's also resource weights. And what that does is it indicates the amount of time that the various threads are waiting for resources, such as memory and processor time. Again, just manually going and executing queries repeatedly and switching between tabs. I just couldn't do that fast enough for there to be any kind of lock contentions. So there's a little bit of waiting. That's probably for some internal resource, but really not a whole lot going on there. You can also look at the data file I/O. So it's been a while since since I ran those queries, but this is going to show the database and log files input or output information. And there, okay, so it took a second to populate there, but really not a whole lot going on there. Very trivial amounts of information involved in those different queries. But this includes statistics on the amount of data read from and written to the disk. And so this is really useful because it can help you find databases that are being especially hard hit with activity, causing the disk activity to be a bottleneck to performance. And so again, this may lead you to say, okay, I need to, this particular database is getting hit really hard. I need to partition this out to multiple hard drives on the server. So that would be one of many kinds of solutions to that kind of problem. Okay, can also come down here to recent expensive queries. These are essentially showing the most expensive queries. None of the ones that I ran a few moments ago were very expensive at all, but you could see some pretty big numbers in here if there's any queries that are making some very strong demands upon the resources of this server. All right, so I can go down to the last one here, active expensive queries. This shouldn't show any, I don't believe. Give it a couple seconds. This is essentially going to show the most active queries and let you really focus in on what's currently executing and that are making the greatest demands on various server resources. So this just gives a little bit more of a refined view into what's happening to slow the server that let you help identify bottlenecks. So if you come in, a server is acting really slow, you may find that there's one query from one application that is just dragging down the server because it requires so many resources, memory or processor or hard drive or whatever it might be. So perhaps you can either maybe put a throttle in that query, you can redesign it to use objects in different ways that reduce the load, but it lets you identify specifically what's going wrong so that you can take action to ease that query. And sometimes maybe just have to add memory to the server. That can be very expensive. You probably don't want that to be the first thing that you do, but at least you know that that's what the problem is. Okay, nice thing about all of these views is that, if I come back up here just a little bit, they all let you search and filter the various columns. So, for example, to filter the list, I can select an item here, and maybe I just want to hone in on this particular query. Now, this is just one unique query here, but now I can focus on that one query. Okay, so if I select all, maybe I want to do by execution time, and so there, let me expand that. So the executions per minute, so I selected 12, and so you can filter that data. So a lot of times, again, on a very active production server, there can be a lot of rows of data here, but you can filter down into that very easily. Okay, and one nice thing about Activity Monitor is that it makes heavy use of tooltips. Okay, so if I come over here and hover over there, it gives me that full item there. This gives me a little bit more information about what each of these columns is, so a better description of it, so I don't have to remember what's executions per minute. It gives me at least a little snippet to remind me that it's doing X, Y, Z, whatever that particular thing might be. So, Activity Monitor, very handy tool. You're not limited to working with Management Studio with a single instance of SQL Server. You can connect to other instances, whether they're running on the local machine, another server on the intranet, or another server across the internet. As long as you can connect to the instance, that you have permissions, that you have the network bandwidth to do that, then you can use pretty much any feature in Management Studio on that other instance, assuming that you have the necessary security permissions on that other server. Management Studio has several ways to connect to other SQL Server instances. One way to connect to another server is to use the Connect button here within Object Explorer. And you can use this to connect to various services on other instances this way, not just the database engine. But in this case, I'm going to stick to the database engine. I click on that, and I get the Connect to Server dialog box, and I can enter another server name. It populates it with the last server that I connected, which is local, which is an alias for the default instance of SQL Server on this local machine. But I can type in different machine names, IP addresses, and so forth. And so in this case, this machine name is LNO dev. So I'm going to connect, this is going to connect to the same instance that I have here, but it's going to connect using the machine name rather than local. Okay? Now this can be handy because instead of using Windows authentication as I just did, maybe I want to connect to the same instance of SQL Server, but connect using a different user that allows me to look at the database using a different user's permissions. So that's one scenario that I sometimes use that kind of functionality with. But now I'm connected to two instances, really two instances of the same instance, if you will, not to get too caught up in the semantics of it. But this easily could be an entirely separate instance on the same machine or another machine out on the network. Another nice thing about Management Studio is you can also create lists of registered servers using the Registered Servers window in Management Studio. That's not open by default, but like most windows here, I can come in to the View menu and open up Registered Servers. So if I expand this, I can see that it has a couple of things already in here. The local server groups, which is desktop KKGTBOT, not quite sure where that name comes from, as well as some central management servers. But what I can do here is if I want to create essentially a set of persistent information to a connection to easily come back and connect to this, I can right-click on this and select New Server Registration. I get essentially a variation of the connection dialog box, and I'm going to type in local. And I can select the different authentication, and I can give it a name here, and give it a description, and I can test it to make sure that I can connect to it. That's going to be more useful if I'm selecting SQL Server authentication, but if I'm connecting to another server on another machine here, and I'm either using Windows authentication if it's on the internet, or using SQL Server authentication or Active Directory authentication, I can test it to make sure that I entered, for example, the username and password correctly, or that I do have permissions on that server under the login that I'm currently authenticated against Windows. I can test that to make sure that I can access the server that way. I may not have admin permissions, but I may have some other kind of permissions. So I'll go ahead and save that, and there's that server instance that I created. And so I can go ahead and create as many other local server groups or central management servers as I want to, and then this persists the connection information, which makes it a lot easier to go in and connect to those databases or those server instances in the future. As I mentioned earlier, Management Studio is built on top of Visual Studio, and that's a rich and robust development environment. One of the strengths is that you can easily customize the user interface to meet your needs and preferences. In fact, that's one of the things that makes Visual Studio such an amazing development environment. No matter what kind of application you're developing, whether it's programming code or a website or databases or database objects, you have pretty much full control over the environment that you're working in. For example, it's very easy to manage the windows within Management Studio. So one nice feature is that I have Object Explorer. It's always visible the way I have it configured at the moment, but I can use the push pin here to hide it and move it out of the way if I want to have this area completely available. Maybe there's a complex visual designer I'm using. Maybe I'm using a code editor that displays, and I have long lines of code, and I want to, as I'm working on the code, I want to maximize what I can see of the code. Now this area is completely available for me to do my work in. If I need to come back over and use it, I can hover the mouse and click on it and do whatever I need to do here and come back over to the main area. And I don't have another window open, so there isn't actually I can come over here, open that window, and you can see that Object Explorer disappears. And if I do that, I can have fun all day going back and forth between those windows. But anyway, typically I'm going to have a window open here, and so when I select that window again, I'm clicking it here, then this window would go away and once again be hidden. But I can also click on the item there. Okay, for the purpose of the course, I want to pin that back open. But the nice thing too is that I can easily close the window if I'm done with it. Typically I'm not going to close Object Explorer because I use this window all the time. But if I did, I could close it there, and now I have even more disk space. Maybe I don't use it directly, maybe I have the files open, whatever the scenario might be. If I need to open it again, I can come here to the View menu, or just click F8, and that opens it up again with the current connection to the database that I had. All right, I can also grab the title bar here and move it to other parts of the window. And you can see that I get this nice graphical utility. So if I wanted to dock it to the top, now it's docked to the top of the screen. If I wanted to move it back to the side of the screen there, I could hover over that right there, and it kind of changes shape a little bit, but there we go. Or I can dock it to the bottom. I can dock it with other windows if I want it to fill up the entire window. Not really appropriate for Object Explorer. This is really more appropriate for a code window or a designer or a graphical designer. But I could certainly do that if I wanted to use it. And move it around to different parts. If I wanted to include it over here on the right side of the window, I could do that. And now what's interesting here is I have two windows that are docked over on the side here. If I wanted to pin this open, I now have two side-by-side windows. Alternatively, I could come over here and put this window into the same window there. Now I have this tabbed kind of an interface. Or I can come back over here and put it back where it belongs. So a lot of flexibility. And I'll go ahead and unpin that. In fact, I'll go ahead and close that. I'm not going to be using the properties window all that much. So you have a lot of options, including to right-click on this, and you can float it so it floats out in the middle of the screen. You can dock it as a tab document, so that's in the middle of the screen. I can also hide it if I want to, and now it's just completely hidden, so I have to come over here to Object Explorer again, but I'm going to drag it over here because I'm just used to the default location there docked on the left side there. But in my real development machine that I'm not using for teaching about SQL Server, I'll typically have it unpinned so it goes away, but it's easily accessible whenever I need it. Okay, so whatever works best for you. Okay, so one caution about this flexibility with Windows. Once in a while, you'll close a window in Management Studio and not be able to find a menu item that reopens the window. Most of the windows are available here within the View menu, and keep in mind that there's also this Other Windows here that exposes a couple of additional views there. When you're working with code, there's also a Debug Windows that opens up different kind of windows as well. So most of the windows that you're typically working with are available on the View or Debug menu, and there may be some other hidden ones within the menu in different contexts. But again, once in a while you'll close a window and not be able to find a menu item that reopens that window. Sometimes this means that you're no longer in a state or a context where the window is available. But other times there's no apparent reason for a missing menu item. In those cases, you can reset the entire window layout by selecting this window and reset window layout. Okay, so I'll click on that. Are you sure? Because it's going to close any of the windows and clean up the environment. Notice that it puts Object Explorer back, even in its default width, and also reopens this property window, which is open by default when you first run Management Studio. So I really have gone back to its pristine state. So again, just be aware that the option resets the entire working space. So it may close some windows and open others. So really use it only as a last resort unless you really do want to return to the default Windows layout. And frankly, as you're getting to know Management Studio, go wild with Windows. Open it up different windows, dock them in different places, go wild. Even if it doesn't work how you ultimately want the workspace to be, you can just go back up there. Again, it's window, reset window layout, and you can get back to the starting point. And now with that experience, you can open up Windows and do whatever you want so that it works for you. Okay, but wait, there's more. Management Studio has an almost dizzying array of configuration options. Most of the options are available here in this Tools Options dialog box. And this is yet another feature of Visual Studio, although it's customized a bit for Management Studio, the specific SQL Server use of the environment. Okay, so this is some place where you really want to explore what's available. So one thing I will point out is that you have this Environment section and you have Startup. So at Startup, by default, it opens up Object Explorer. So that's why Object Explorer always appears when I freshly start Management Studio. Okay, but you do have other options. If you're doing a lot of coding, you're writing a lot of new code every time you open up Management Studio, you could automatically open up a query window, which is the SQL Server text editor. You can open up both Object Explorer and a query window. Open it up and Activity Monitor. So if you're an admin on a SQL Server instance, you spend a lot of time in Activity Monitor monitoring a production instance, or maybe even a test or staging instance of SQL Server. Maybe you always want to open up Activity Monitor so it's available. Or you can also open up an empty environment. And so that's a nice scenario. If every time you open up Management Studio, you're doing different things, you don't want to have different windows cluttering up the environment, you can go ahead and do that and then open up whatever windows that you need for whatever in particular you're needing to do in that particular session. Now, one downside is that this list is not customizable, but at least you do have some options. And another nice option here is this checkbox that says Hide System Objects in Object Explorer. This is unchecked by default so that you see everything that's available. If you never work with system tables, remember I showed you in the Wide World Importers database, there were some system tables. You had to expand an additional node to get them. Let's say you just never want to see those. You never want to see the system stored procedures. You never do anything with them. You never explore them, or maybe you get to know SQL Server well enough so that you don't need to explore those anymore. Then you can go ahead and click that, and it'll go ahead and hide those system objects. But I like to leave it open because fairly often I want to go in, I'm writing some stored procedure or a function that uses a system stored procedure. I can't remember quite what the system stored procedure does or how it does it, so I can go in and look at the source code very easily using Object Explorer. So generally I just leave this option unchecked. Earlier versions of SQL Server included help in the form of books online, or you'll often see it written just as BOL. With SQL Server 2016, BOL has been replaced by SQL Server Technical Documentation. That's the formal name of it. These are an extensive set of online web pages on Microsoft's site. The sheer quantity of information is staggering. I know of no one who has the time or longevity to have read even a substantial subset of these very copious, complete documents. But context-sensitive help is available throughout SQL Server, including Management Studio and most all of the other tools that you'll explore in this course. So you'll have ready access to the documentation. So it's well worth your time to explore the documentation now as you're getting familiar with SQL Server in order to become familiar with what's there and start to learn more about the product. But then you'll have easy access to it as you use it in your day-to-day work. Help is available in just about every nook and cranny of Management Studio, including from the main Help menu item right up here within the menus, as well as through right-click pop-up menus, pressing the F1 button, and frankly, probably places I've not even found yet. So here I am, Object Explorer is selected. I'll hit F1. It'll take a moment. I want to make changes. Firefox is my default browser on this machine. I'm not sure why it's needing to update it. Well, fortunately that didn't take long. And so it opens up this help page about Object Explorer in my default browser on this machine. And so I can scroll down here and learn a lot more about Object Explorer and various tasks I might want to perform. And there's a lot of other information on the side. So this shows the overall appearance of how the technical documentation is laid out. So there's tons of information there. Okay, so I'll go ahead and close the browser there. But one issue here is that not everyone has an always available internet connection. So the help menu gives you two options. So if I come up here to help, I can select the set help preference. And by default, it's set to launch in the browser. And so that's why when I hit F1, it opened up in Firefox, again, my default browser. But I can also launch it by default within the help viewer. So if I select that option, I'm immediately prompted with this dialog box here about downloading content. I've not yet downloaded content for English. Do I want to download it now? So I can either select yes to do it now or no to defer it to later. Now, this latter option of no kind of defeats the purpose because the first time I do this, I need to have an internet connection so I can be able to download that across the internet. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click on yes, and I'll maybe cancel out if I need to. And so this is now the offline help viewer. And what you can use this dialog box for is to select which parts of the help system that I want to download. So for example, if I never use Python, maybe I don't want to download that. If I don't use the .NET framework, I can cancel out of that. So I can go down through the list and add and remove different options for the help that I want to have available. And you will want to pay attention to the estimated download size here, particularly the aggregate as I add and remove different things. So if I click on add on just a few random things, these probably make absolutely no sense whatsoever. But you can see that I have an estimated download size of a little over a gig. I have lots of disk space and gives me of actually the required disk space for once it's all unpacked on my local machine. So I'm not going to actually download anything here, but just keep in mind that periodically Microsoft updates portions of the help system, which is a good thing because they're constantly adding new articles, new information, updating stuff when they find errors and so forth. So you'll occasionally need to refresh help and download the new bits that comprise that help. So anyway, that's a really nice option for being able to access the very extensive help system when you're offline. And you can customize it fairly extensively.